Enemy power-up detected.
This is Incoming Missile, a MechWarrior Online Podcast. Hi 7 MechWarriors, this is Cozened, Indigo and Captain Cat coming at you again, hoping that you're having good games out there, that you're blowing off plenty of side torsos. So today we're bringing you a mini pod, and we're taking the opportunity to give you our thoughts on the recent NGNGtv podcast with Chris and Paul, and the focus on balance and the results of the PTS server. We hope you've taken the opportunity to listen to that podcast. We encourage you to have a listen to what Sean, Chris, Paul and Daeron say. And of course, if you're listening to this one, we hope you take the time to think about the things that we have said. Now, one of the main points to come out of the NGNGtv podcast is that they want to hear your feedback. So make sure that you do get on the forums and have your say, give your thoughts. If it is that you do want to contribute to change in the game, then the best way is to tell PGI what it is you think. As mentioned, this is a mini-pod. If you haven't gone through and listened to our first episode, I'd encourage you to do that now. We'll be releasing the second of our podcasts focused on balance in the next week or so. So make sure that you have subscribed to your major podcast platform, to our channel on YouTube or SoundCloud, or keeping an eye on our Twitter account to see when that is released. And of course, we want to take this opportunity to thank those that have already listened to our first episode and those that have followed us on those various channels. So we'd be keen to hear what you think about today. Make sure to send us your feedback about our discussion, and make sure that you do tune into that NGNGtv podcast and have a listen to what Sean, Daeron, Paul and Chris have said. The best way to have your say is to post on the forums. So jump on the mwomerks.com site and have your say there. And if you do enjoy this content, please consider supporting us. You can find us on Patreon and access various tiers of support to help us produce these podcasts. So thanks once again, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. 07 MechWarriors. Alright, so we are going to discuss the recent podcast that NGNGtv did with Paul and Chris. Give you a bit of an overview of what they discussed and our thoughts on it.
To kick us off, PGI had a discussion about the PTS, which they clarified stands for post-traumatic stress. Public test server, I believe.
Yes, heavy emphasis on the word test.
Through its couple of incarnations there, 1.0 and 1.1. Talked about a little bit about the results. They got some insights out of that, which hopefully you guys have seen posted up on the forums, basically stating that they weren't going to go ahead with it, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, obviously the purpose was to test some things out, and in particular changing some values around clan lasers and course recoil, but effectively they're seeing whether making those changes is going to have what outputs you can get from that, and whether that's something that they should go ahead with.
Yeah, I mean the key insight there was that it adversely affects the mechs that aren't targeted by the nerf. Like, it's not hitting just the death strike, and it's people predicted that my own feedback was that on the public test feedback was that the ice ferret feels kind of worthless, and so they're not going to go ahead with that in that form.
Yeah, Chris and Sean Lang talked about their experience of it. Obviously, Phil's being a bit different from Chris. Chris said he tries to be agnostic and wait until he sees what happens, and what he's testing in there is maybe a bit different to what everyone else is. But I mean, Phil talked about the fact that in changing the damage values in 1.0, basically people are just going to do workarounds, that even if you change up that alpha, then they're gonna add large lasers or other things. He said that even in 1.1, with the increase to duration, he didn't think that the change was particularly significant.
And it's important to note, I think, that it's flexible, adaptable mechs like the Deathstrike, which can really cope with some changes like that. They can just, those weapons aren't great anymore. No worries, I'll just equip a couple more of these, or switch something out. And it's the mechs like the Ice Ferret, which is reliant on those ER medium lasers, that doesn't have another option that it can just grab. It doesn't have the pod space to just chuck in a large laser or two and still be effective.
From the the feedback that Phil gave and that Chris gave, it doesn't sound as though the PTS was particularly enlightening.
I guess on a surface level, we see the public test server and talk about the public test server as being a way that people can go out there and test drive those changes. PGI can look at that data, draw conclusions from it, and we can all get a look and see how it's going to pan out and try and get a gauge on it. A company like PGI should be doing PR, and they should be listening to their community and gauging player feedback and how liked or disliked changes are going to be. That's the kind of thing they should be doing.
Yeah, giving players the chance to have a play around, or at least feel as they're contributing. It's what the community scream out for, isn't it? So you've certainly got to give them the props for doing that and giving people that opportunity. So, Capn, I really wanted to talk to you about, the next and probably one of the most pertinent points from the podcast, which is
the K2 too tanky?
Yeah. I think the memes are going to flow freely around the tankiness of a K2. I love the mech, to be fair, but tanky probably wouldn't be how I described it. Just around changing the weapon values and around, clan laser vomit in particular that was spoken about specifically. What are some of the points around that? How did you feel about what they talked about?
Yeah, I thought they were pretty bang on, really, with some of the things that they said. It really felt to me like they were ticking off a lot of the things that the community wants to hear, that they know about, about that they understand that proportions of mech balances are based on a lot of different things above and beyond just the weapons that you have on there. That it has a lot to do with other parameters such as like mech geometry and things like that. It seemed very clear to me that they're intending to bring back the nerfs to clan lasers, and it's by no means off the table. They're just going to look at it from a different angle.
Do you think that's necessary? Good idea?
Yeah, actually. I'm in the camp that I think clan lasers are slightly overpowered and deserving of a small nerf. I think that it's easy to see outliers in a game like this or in a system like this where everything's interconnected and overestimate how overpowered something is because it's so prevalent. You see a lot of clan laser vomit. It's kind of I've heard it said, and I kind of agree that the meta is already kind of shifting away from clan laser vomit somewhat, but it is still strong. And it could just be that a small nerf will be enough to bring it in line with everything else, and anything heavy-handed will just, again, like we saw with small pulse lasers, make them completely irrelevant and not worth taking at all.
Paul and Chris, I thought, brought up some really good points around clan lasers, and obviously they have a really, really good understanding there. They used the Hellbringer and the Ebon Jag as examples, and saying that clan laser is setting those mechs so far above their equivalents on the IS side as to make those other mechs almost redundant, and that's kind of one of the main risks and that they set around clan lasers, and the reason that they need to be balanced, I guess, is because they may be crowding out other mechs and other weapon styles and loadouts. But how far they go to bring that balance back, I guess that's what the community need to feedback on, and some of the things that maybe we're a little worried about, maybe not because of the mechanics that will change in game, but maybe even about the way it makes people feel about the game.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that, that almost trumps everything else. 5 tonners, like you said, they're hammering into the MNJ. And the first question that popped into my head is is that the best comparison? Is it necessary for each 65 tonner to be in line with each other 65 tonner, or are there counters outside of the same tonnage bracket that are more important?
Okay, so I agree with that, but let me ask you this: is there a, because as we discussed last time in our last podcast, that balance is about preventing a dominant meta, a dominant strategy emerging, and either implementing counters to that, rock, scissors, paper, or bringing that back in line so that it's not just a button that you can go to it's not a win button. But should those mechs be equal, and if they shouldn't, what is the counter to clan lasers? What is the counter to a Hellbringer?
Yeah, well, I mean, getting in amongst them with a lighters or a couple of piranhas it's always a good way to counter anything. But I mean, it's undeniable that Hellbringer is a strong mech. I mean, being able to get in their face with anything that can DPS them down is the obvious counter, because once a Hellbringer gets hot, it's pretty much useless and something's in your face. It's if they manage to push you, you've already lost, really. If you're fighting SRMs and AC20s and things like that, because you blow your wad, and then the strategy is to hide until you cool down. Well, you can't hide if somebody's 100 meters away from you.
On average, though, are the clan lasers going to be better across all situations, and therefore they're going to be a more dominant strategy to adopt than those counters that we put in place?
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, I think they are deserving of a slight nerf. How big or small that nerf is the difficult job of PGI to work out. How far do you need to push that lever before the other things come up in comparison to it? I mean, and is it that you need to, as well as doing small nerfs to that dominant weapon, also give buffs to the counters?
Yeah. So I mean, that would be my next point, is to say, rather than using a balance mechanism, an internal mechanism like changing the values and the damage outputs or the capabilities of those weapons, is it better for, like we talked about in our last episode, is it better for PGI to look at other ways to bring balance to that situation, such as direct counters?
And I mean, I think
reflective armor or
yeah, direct counters is an interesting idea. I think we've got counters in the game that just need to be pressed into service, really. I mean, I'd love to see some more weapons and things in the game. I think that, the Civil War update really refreshed the game, brought people back, and, heavy course, MRMs, ATMs, all those kind of weapons that came in, most of them, are have really added a lot of flavor and options for mechs that, in fact, reinvigorated mechs that were otherwise kind of dead, like, say, the IV4. And I think that kind of ties into what they talked about straight afterwards, which was talking about how a nerf to Clan Laser Vomit would necessitate a nerf to IS Survival.
Yeah. I mean, can you explain why that would be needed?
I don't know if it's my place to really explain the reasoning behind that, because I'm not quite sure I agree with it. But I mean, I can try. So the idea, I guess, is that if it assumes that the IS Survival is put in place as a direct consequences of the power of Clan Laser Vomit, right? Does that make sense?
Or is it saying, in some way, is it also, though, that the power, the damage output of clans is the hallmark of that faction, and the hallmark of the Inner Sphere faction is that tankiness?
Oh, I wish it was saying that, because that's what I love about those two factions. I love that there's that asymmetric balance between Clan and IS. Like you and I have spoken about that there's 720 something odd mechs in the game. We don't want them all to be the same, and we certainly
Yeah.
don't want Clan and IS to be the same, despite what some people say. We, we've got to give them a reason to be there. We've got to give them a reason to be different.
Yeah.
And for me, that um, clan weapons are superior and IS are tanky is the quintessential difference between the two.
So, what were your thoughts, Captain, on Paul's comments around time to kill?
So Paul talked about power creep and time to kill as a direct response to the idea that we should be putting a load of buffs into the game, that we should be doing more buffs than nerfs, is the sort of community feedback headline, and that that the damage that would do to TTK or time to kill would it just writes that off. He just vetoes that basically, and that also that buffs would affect heavy and assaults disproportionately more because they're the ones that can take the most heavy weapons and things like that. I had a couple of thoughts on that, and the first one is that there is whole weapon groups in the game currently that have been, even some of them that were from the Civil War patch, that were designed, tested, coded, put in the game. They've been balanced. Basically what I'm saying is that they've put in time and they're not getting used because they're not good. So the micro pulse laser is one of those. I know there's going to be people out there going, I use those on such and such a mech, and it's great. Well, you can always make a mech work, whether it's competing on the level of some of the other weapons is a different question altogether. It's not good. I mean, I heard Paul say elsewhere in the podcast in regards to LRMs that they were, before the buffs, dead weight in the game. Well, there's a lot of dead weight in the game.
I will say that he did add to that, though, to say it was combined with a level of hostility towards players that carry those weapons that also kind of dictated the changes there. So
yeah. Well, we can talk about the LRMs as well. But the key thing that I was pulling out of that was that we don't want stuff to be in the game, nobody's using it, because what's the point of that? And I think that the idea that buffing weapon systems would decrease time to kill, i.e., make it that you die sooner, is it's not telling the whole truth of the story, because at the moment, time to kill is predominantly set by the most popular and powerful weapons in the game, right? Because, if you look around on the battlefield, the vast majority of people are using the weapons that are the most effective and not using the weapons that aren't effective. So making changes to those under-effective weapons is not going to increase time to kill. It's just going to increase the amount of that you see on the battlefield. Does that make sense?
it does. So you could make micro pulse lasers better, but if other clan lasers are still good, people are still going to carry those.
Well, here's another example that's probably closer to most people's heart than micropulse lasers, which probably not many people care about. AC-20s. Now, AC-20s have the ghost heat limit of 1, meaning that if you fire 2, you get a pretty decent heat spike from that.
Yeah, big old heat spike.
Yeah, that is set from a time in the game when the kind of mechs that could bring AC-20s were initially catapults, and then later on Jaeger mechs, and they were the only mechs in the game that could take dual AC-20s. And at the time, that was an outlier, and it needed to be looked at and tuned, because that would have reduced time to kill. We're in an environment in the game where we now have clan mechs for a start, but above and beyond that, we have dual heavy course, where you can charge up and fire 2 heavy course slugs which zip across the battlefield at 1,000,000 miles an hour and smash into someone for 50 damage and no heat.
Yeah.
And then AC-20s, for some reason, which are slow as hell, you have to lob shot them. They have no range and have massive heat while you're limited to firing one at a time. So this is the kind of area where you could change that value. You could buff AC-20s by increasing the ghost heat limit so that you can fire 2 at a time, at the very least. And it wouldn't have any effect on time to kill in the game because, I mean, the kind of mechs that would bring them are the same kind of mechs that are currently taking heavy course. Maybe you can go a little lighter on the mechs that you bring and potentially some cheese builds in the medium category. But for the most part, the fact that it's got super short range, it's got decent heat anyway, even without ghost heat, and it's slow, is going to offset that.
Okay, I'm liking that idea. Are you saying, Alligator, that you don't necessarily need to nerf clan lasers that much? You could bring other weapon systems up, but as long as you don't take them up beyond, the most dominant weapon systems that are there already, or the potential that they have, then you're not increasing total time to kill.
That's right, or decreasing time to kill, meaning that you die sooner. It gets a bit confusing to talk about increasing time to kill, decreasing time to kill. But yeah.
How would that influence, say, the other two important things, such as the parity between IS and clan and the parity across the mech classes? Do you think there would be any influence there?
Yeah, I mean, so a change to AC-20, I mean, that's not going to affect anything lighter than, let's say 50 tons very much, in terms of that they're not the ones bringing it anyway. So that if you buff AC-20 mechs, you're talking about something that's 50 tons or heavier, right? But that's not really going to change the environment that those lighter mechs are driving in, because that's already an environment that has dual heavy course or dual course or laser vomit in it.
Makes sense.
And then along with that, I mean, there's a whole host of lighter weapons which are needing some love. I mean, small pulse lasers aren't in a terrible place, but they could be a bit better. SRMs are having a little bit of trouble at the moment. We talked about the micropulse and those sort of things, but so there's a whole host of weapons that lights and light mediums could use that could also be brought up to be competitive in the marketplace, in the weapon marketplace, with the things that are already there and being used.
So rather than bringing clan lasers down, it might be beneficial to bring other weapon systems up, and one of the benefits to that would be that other mechs and other playstyles might become more viable. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, exactly. And you're also buffing the counters to that laser vomit as well, because once you like I said, once you push into the range of a clan laser vomit mech with your DPS weapons, well, they're in a whole lot of trouble once they get hot. Talking about the stated aims of PGI here, which is not to have dead weight in the mech lab, and not only that, but they're bought and paid for. We've invested our dev time in it. Let's make sure they're getting used.
Nice. That sounds good. All right. Now, speaking of pushing into range, I know that you were very excited about this part of the conversation, which is about LRMs. I know that you really like to play LRM mechs for anyone out there. So,
slander. It's a vile slander.
Yes, I mean, you cop a lot of hostility, so I try and stick up for you when people are slandering you about your LRM, your LRM supernova. No, seriously, look, I'll start because I actually really appreciated what they talked about. I thought there was a huge amount of merit in initially what they were saying about buffing LRMs, because there had been a certain amount of redundancy there, not just that the weapon system itself had kind of faded into obscurity, but that in playing LRMs people were copping a lot of hostility. The one point that I thought was maybe missed was that the hostility around LRMs isn't necessarily about the weapon. The hostility around LRMs, I think, is the playstyle that's associated with the weapons.
Mm.
So that if you are using indirect fire, and you're 600-700 meters back and you're in a heavy or an assault, that means that your team is maybe missing out on your armor, and you taking some shots for the team. And I think the best evidence of that is that I don't see or hear the same hate for ATMs that I do for LRMs, or the same hostility, because to make ATMs truly effective, you kind of need to be up there within the kind of 400 to 200 meter range. So how did you feel about the discussion around the LRMs?
Yeah, I can appreciate some of what you're saying there in terms of the hostility and things like that. I mean, personally, like I've just said, I despise lock-on weapons as a personal choice for me to run. I've never really had a problem with other people bringing it, as long as they were, doing it thoughtfully and being effective. I was surprised to hear him say that nobody was bringing LRMs beforehand and that they were kind of dead weight. The LRMs have always kind of been there. I would say before the buff, there was probably going to be LRM in every game, just as part of the game. Maybe they're not there as such a massive part of the sort of the marketplace in terms of what weapons are in each game. Like maybe there's a higher proportion of clan laser vomit or those other things that were talked about in the podcast, but they were there. I think one big change is whenever there's a buff to LRMs, people use it more. Whether or not it makes a huge difference, you're going to see them more prevalently on the battlefield, because people are taking them out there to give it a go for a start initially, and then when they find them effective, and especially when half the teams out there with LRMs, they are more effective en masse, and so that shifts the meta in itself. Just the mere fact that they were buffed, whatever the buff is, shifts the meta because people take it out to try it, and then en masse they're more effective, so people keep bringing it.
Yeah, but shifting the meta would mean that LRMs would need to be a dominant strategy. I agree with a lot of the feedback that I don't think that's the case. I think that the feedback around the buffs to LRM has been all outrage at the playstyle that's associated with LRMs, the hang in the back and shoot from, using the rest of your team as armor. I don't think it's related to the weapons themselves, because I think LRMs can be effective. I've got no problem if they buff the use of it, but my worry is that it's one of those, it's a butterfly effect thing where they are encouraging the use of the weapon, but they're not addressing the playstyle that goes along with it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight that you've had really quickly on LRMs. So I mean, undeniably an unpopular change amongst certain camp within the community, and they have said that they're gonna put in some rebalancing to nerf LRMs in the August patch, didn't they say?
Yeah, so the changes to Artie and cooldown to Narc, buffing ECM.
I do think that these changes to LRMs are pretty appealing. If they're not going to look at reducing or reversing some of those buffs that they've made, then sure, make them a little bit more challenging to use, and reduce the effectiveness of those assistant things like Artemis and Tag and stuff, for sure.
Okay, so one of the last things that they covered in the podcast was Paul's discussion around the scope of balance, alluding to that kind of butterfly effect that we've already mentioned. And he did bring up the example of the engine desync. What were your thoughts around that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, talking about rolling back the agility for some mechs, and the example they use with the Atlas, great. Do it, tomorrow. Do it in this August patch for sure. I do think that the engine desync again like some of the other changes discussed, I think the engine desync was a good change because it was just straight, if your mech can bring a big engine, it's better at moving around than other mechs. And I think I like the idea that mobility is set by values per chassis or even per variant in some cases. And moving some mechs back towards that pre-skill tree baseline is the kind of change that we're looking for when we're talking about buffing mobility and stuff like that. I think it was kind of ironic that they talked about the straight after the engine desync conversation, they talked about how if they do these nerfs, obviously we're talking about Clan Laser Vomit in this podcast, but you could be talking about. I think they're expanding it to talk about any nerf that they may do in the future. Well, that can be countered by quirks for any mechs that are overly affected. For example, the Ice Ferret. Well, desync has been out for over a year now, and now they're talking about that some things are not in line. That now they're talking about, some mechs got overly affected by that. And I think that is really the yardstick that you need to gauge community reactions to these kind of changes by, is that a lot of people are quite jaded and they expect that if there is a change put into the game, like a nerf, that any rebalancing done after the fact to once it's obvious that change killed small pulse lasers or killed the mobility on an Atlas, how long does it take to get that reactive patch to fix that? And it historically it just takes far too long.
I mean, Paul and Chris did talk about the fact that with the engine desync, if people invested in mobility, such as with the Atlas, then you get to mobility and agility figures that are bigger or better than what they were prior to engine desync. And they did talk about people maybe don't understand that some of those decisions or trade-offs are needed. But the counter to that is I did see some stuff posted already on the forums about needing, it is a significant investment of your skill points to achieve those things. And if an Atlas, people will tend to default where they buff, they skill up the strengths of a mech. So if a mech has armor quirks, then they're going to, look at survivability to buff that. And by doing that, it means that there's simply not enough left over to invest in those other trees. I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you think that players, maybe sometimes ignore that there's going to be those trade-offs?
Potentially. I mean, I think amongst the savvy players, we know exactly what the advantages or disadvantages to taking those nodes is going to be. And when you're talking about an Atlas, having a node that does a few % of nothing is really doesn't feel like a worthwhile investment of your skill points. The amount of mobility that a mech like an Atlas gets out of a full mobility tree is barely noticeable, and I really struggle to believe that for the example of the 100-tonners at least, that a mobility treed Atlas is as mobile as it was pre-desync. On the other hand, it is true that people are knowingly taking a trade-off to grabbing mobility on an assault in exchange for grabbing survival and weapon trees, that sort of thing. That for sure is true. It's, I mean, at the end of the day, that is your choice to do that. But on the other hand, it's probably the right choice to make as well. That if you're in a big fat assault, mobility is not really what you're about anyway. Certainly in the case of the Annihilator or whatever, you're kind of just a turret, putting yourself in the right place to start with and not really moving around that much is the key there. mobility is certainly speed tweak and things like that aren't going to make any difference. And then there's mechs like, say, the Gargoyle, which, I mean, Paul talked about, buffing those mechs up like the Atlas and things, so that they would actually be more mobile than they were before the desync. Once you take those nodes, or if you choose to take those nodes, well, I mean, in my experience, when I'm looking at mechs like the Gargoyle, which already are super mobile, then I'm like, great, I can skip the mobility tree because they're already pretty damn mobile. I don't need to waste my investment into that, and I can really double down on weapons tree, survival tree, that sort of thing. So unfortunately, I'm not sure that I think conversely, buffing the mobility of those mechs is not going to increase the amount of people taking an investment into mobility. In fact, I think people just take that free ride.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, there's more than one way to skin a cat, to use that phrase, and each their own with the skill tree. Even at the highest levels of play, I see a lot of different ways of looking at the skill tree, and people believing that this is the obvious best way, and that don't align with other highly skilled players. So I think the skill tree kind of succeeded there, in that it is kind of a personal choice thing. People do it their own way. Then, so the final thoughts there in that podcast were around how if people want to get their feedback in front of Paul especially, they need to be doing it in the forums in the Brown Sea, and not on Reddit or Twitter or podcasts.
Yeah, maybe, but I've got no doubt that Paul is listening to this, so thanks for being an avid listener, Paul. We appreciate you, mate.
Hi, Paul.
Yeah, like, just to reiterate that, do get in there and give your feedback. I've read what's been on there so far, and Paul has been very active. So you've got to have your say. So keep it respectful so that you don't get redacted. Try and make some good cogent salient points, and yeah, but get your opinion on them.
Yeah, I need to practice my non-emotional arguing. I certainly could be better at that.
Yeah, like, I think everyone can. I mean, you get guys like Terragato that can put it in a really structured and balanced way. But yeah, look, as long as you're respectful, I think it's all right to be emotional. But yeah, get on there and have your say is the message. So be sure to get your feedback into the forums, and of course we are also very keen to hear your feedback on this issue or on some of the things that we have discussed today. Great to hear whether you disagree or agree with me in particular. But yeah, get as much comments to us as you can. You can do that by tweeting at us at IncomingP. Be sure to follow us on Twitter. You can post comments on YouTube, where we will post this, or of course on the podcast platforms that this will feature. If you do want to give us an in-depth conversation, then you can reach us at incomingmissilepodcast@gmail.com. I think we've covered it all. All right, well, thanks for listening. We'll catch you with another episode not too far away. We're going to continue this discussion around balance, so we look forward to talking to you all then.